Welcome to the week 5 lecture looking at the steps that it took to get to the Revolutionary War. Last week we ended with the British victory in the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, and this week is looking at what happened in the aftermath of that to lead to revolution. The costs of the French and Indian War had a real significant impact on Britain's finances and its relationship with the American colonies. Britain's national debt had already doubled compared to pre-war levels, and that left the British people feeling pretty heavily taxed. Additionally, the new territories that we acquired as a result of the war required ongoing administrative and military expenditures in order to protect the British Empire that was now expanding. So to address these growing costs, Britain stationed troops in the newly acquired Indian territories and expected the American colonists to contribute to these expenses as they were benefiting from the protection that was provided by the British Army. In 1763, the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763, which aimed to regulate westward expansion by prohibiting colonists from settling in new territories without permission from the British government. This policy required settlers to purchase land from Native Americans, which further complicated colonization efforts. Beyond regulating expansion, the British government sought to assert greater authority over the rapidly growing colonies, fearing that they were slipping away from British control. Tensions then escalated between Native Americans and the British, and this escalated after the war, particularly during Pontiac's War. Native Americans, who had better relations with the French, were pretty dismayed by the British victory, and they were hoping to push settlers back, so they started to attack British forts in the Western Territories. In response, the British resorted to biological warfare by distributing smallpox-infected blankets to native forces. Though peace was eventually restored, the British adopted the French practice of giving gifts to maintain relationships with these native tribes. In order to help recover from the costs of the war and to reassert control over the colonies, Britain enacted a series of acts. The Sugar Act placed duties on imports like wine, coffee, and molasses. Previously, colonists could smuggle molasses from French islands and pay only 1 pence in tax, but the new law imposed a higher tax of 3 pence and signified a crackdown on smugglers through increased paperwork and the seizure of ships. Another act, the Currency Act, forbade the colonists from issuing paper money, requiring that all duties under the Sugar Act be paid in hard currency, or specie, which led to fears that the colonial money supply would be drained. The Quartering Act of 1765 further angered colonists by requiring them to house British troops in their homes. This also created further tension. The Stamp Act, however, was perhaps the most direct affront to the colonists. It imposed a direct tax on legal documents and publications, requiring colonists to purchase a stamp in addition to the paper for these documents, marking the first direct tax levied by Britain on the colonies. The British government did not believe that the Stamp Act violated the principle of no taxation without representation because they argued that all British subjects were represented in Parliament through the concept of virtual representation. According to this view, each member of Parliament represented the entire British Empire, not just their local constituency. As a result, the British government dismissed colonial objections and denied any meaningful difference between external taxes, such as port duties, and internal taxes, like those imposed inland. However, even before the Stamp Act was passed, all 13 colonial assemblies had drafted petitions arguing that the tax violated their rights as British citizens, as they viewed it as taxation without representation. The colonial assemblies were united in their opposition to both internal and external taxes, claiming that both forms of taxation were a violation of the British Constitution. They urged the British government to revert to the requisition method, where Parliament would ask for a sum of money and colonial legislatures would decide how or whether to raise it. Despite these objections, the Stamp Act was passed in February of 1765 and was set to take effect on November 1st, imposing taxes on legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, and dice. In response, colonial legislatures passed resolutions that condemned the Stamp Act as unconstitutional. A group of Boston men known as the Sons of Liberty took more direct action, feeling that the resolutions and petitions were insufficient to defeat this tax. They protested by hanging stamp collectors in effigy and destroying buildings associated with stamp collection. By the time the tax was set to take effect, stamp masters in every colony except Georgia had been forced to resign due to violent resistance. The Sons of Liberty's tactics spread to other colonial port cities, where they formed similar groups and enacted violent protests. Additionally, merchants across the colonies implemented non-importation agreements or boycotts to put pressure on Britain, contributing to the eventual repeal of the Stamp Act. In response to the growing unrest and claims of economic disaster caused by the Stamp Act, British ministers took action by passing 3 key pieces of legislation. The first was the Declaratory Act, which asserted that Parliament held full power and authority to make laws for the colonies. Although it did not explicitly mention the word taxes, this omission led colonists to believe that Parliament was affirming their position that they should not be taxed without representation. The second piece of legislation was the repeal of the Stamp Act, which had been widely criticized as greatly detrimental to the commercial interests of the British Empire. This repeal was celebrated across the colonies, as many believed that economic pressure and boycotts had forced Parliament to reverse its position. At the same time, Parliament passed the Revenue Act of 1766, which reduced the duty on molasses from 3 pence per gallon to 1 pence per gallon, but applied this tax to all molasses, whether British or foreign, imported into the colonies. While this was another example of an external tax, colonists generally only objected to internal taxes, allowing this measure to be implemented without the same level of resistance as the Stamp Act. Despite the celebrations following the Stamp Act's repeal, neither side fully understood the motivations or interpretations of the other. For the British, the real crisis lay in the violent mob actions in the colonies, not the economic concerns that colonists believed had driven Parliament's decision. Both sides, however, wanted to believe that economic pressure, particularly through the use of boycotts, had influenced the repeal. Unbeknownst to the British, this set a precedent for future colonial resistance, as the colonists viewed this as a victory against unjust taxation. The Townshend Program marked a shift in British colonial policy as the new government took a hardline approach toward the American colonies. The program imposed new duties on imports that the colonies could only purchase from Britain, including tea, paper, glass, lead, and paints. Although some duties on tea were removed, the primary motivation behind the program was not revenue generation. Instead, the British aimed to use the new revenue to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges, a move that would strengthen royal authority. Additionally, the program expanded the powers of vice admiralty courts and created a separate organization to enforce trade and revenue laws, headquartered in Boston rather than the more central location of Philadelphia. Meanwhile, the British Army began to withdraw from frontier posts, moving inland toward the coast. This shift alarmed colonists, who questioned why they should bear the costs of enforcing policies they believed infringed on their liberties. Colonial resistance to the Townshend duties proved more challenging than the opposition to the Stamp Act. This was largely due to the distinction between internal and external taxes, which complicated the colonists' response. Non-importation agreements were again employed as a form of protest, though these agreements often harmed the colonies more than Britain. The colonies were far more reliant on British trade, so a full-scale boycott would have been difficult to sustain. Still, the symbolic nature of non-importation agreements had the potential to impact British revenues if the colonies committed to the strategy. However, resistance was not unified, with divisions emerging over the best approach. Some colonists called for non-importation, while others advocated for the use of homespun products to reduce dependence on British goods. The epicenter of resistance was Boston, where tensions between the colonists and British soldiers escalated dramatically. With an increased British military presence in the city, confrontations between the town's watch and army guards became more frequent. By 1770, British soldiers stationed in Boston felt increasingly besieged as groups like the Sons of Liberty harassed merchants who violated these non-importation agreements. These rising tensions culminated in the Boston Massacre, a deadly confrontation in which a group of soldiers, provoked by taunts and the throwing of rocks and snowballs, fired into a crowd, killing 5 colonists and wounding 6 others. Among the dead was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent who became a symbol of the tragedy. The Boston Massacre marked a significant failure in Britain's attempt to use military coercion to maintain control over the colonies. In the wake of the massacre, Britain repealed all the Townshend duties except for the one on tea. And although resistance to British policies subsided, the impact of this repeal was not as great as the repeal of the Stamp Act. In response, colonial legislatures formed committees of correspondence to maintain communication and prepare for future threats to their liberties. As time went on, more colonists became convinced that the British officials were conspiring against their freedoms, sowing the seeds of revolution. The Tea Act was introduced as a government bailout for the struggling East India Company, which was on the verge of bankruptcy and held vast amounts of unsold tea. The act itself repealed import duties on tea in England, but retained them in the colonies, making legal tea cheaper than any other tea available to the colonists. This move effectively granted the East India Company a monopoly over the shipping and distribution of tea in the colonies, which many colonists saw as a Trojan horse. They believed that if they accepted this tax, they would be acknowledging Parliament's right to impose other taxes as well. In response to measures aimed at forcing the colonists to accept the tea and pay the duties, a group of radical colonists organized the Boston Tea Party. Disguised as Native Americans, they boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea, worth approximately $1 million in today's money, into the water. The British reaction to the Boston Tea Party was swift and severe. In retaliation, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which were intended to punish the colonies, particularly Massachusetts. The Boston Port Act closed the city's port until the cost of the destroyed tea was repaid. The Quartering Act of 1774 allowed British soldiers to be housed among civilians, while the Administration of Justice Act permitted British officials or soldiers charged with crimes while performing their duties to be tried in another colony or in England. Additionally, the Massachusetts Government Act altered the colony's charter, making the formally elective council appointive and restricting town meetings. Around this same time, King George III appointed General Thomas Gage, already commander of the British Army in North America, as the new governor of Massachusetts, with the understanding that he could use military force against civilians if necessary. Although unrelated to the Coercive Acts, the Quebec Act was also passed during this time. It granted religious toleration to French Catholics in Quebec, but colonists viewed it as a part of a broader conspiracy to undermine their liberties. Collectively, these measures became known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, further fueling colonial resentment. In response, colonists began forming provincial congresses and to organize resistance, stockpile military supplies, and prepare for potential conflict. This movement culminated in the convening of the First Continental Congress in September of 1774. Delegates from all the colonies except Georgia attended and adopted a policy of non-exportation if Britain did not address colonial grievances. This stance was even more radical than non-importation because it created a situation in which the colonies would refuse to pay their debts to British merchants. The Congress also sought to define colonial rights, agreeing that Parliament could regulate trade, but rejecting any legislation without the colonies' consent. Additionally, they created the Association, an organization responsible for enforcing trade sanctions against Britain, and resolved to reconvene in May of 1775 if British actions remained unsatisfactory. Tensions finally erupted in April of 1775 at the battles of Lexington and Concord, which marked the beginning of open conflict between Britain and the colonies. In June of 1775, during the early stages of the Revolutionary War, colonists fortified Breed's Hill, which overlooked Boston. General William Howe of the British Army launched 3 frontal assaults to reclaim the high ground, but the fighting was characterized by improvised tactics for much of 1775 and 1776. The Second Continental Congress reconvened in May of 1775 and took several significant actions. They voted to establish a Continental Army, appointing George Washington as its commander-in-chief. The Congress also authorized an invasion of Canada in an effort to win over the French population, but this campaign proved disastrous. In a bid to address the concerns of moderates who were hesitant to sever ties with Britain, the Congress adopted the Olive Branch Petition, aimed primarily at the middle colonies. This petition sought to appease those reluctant to fully break away from Britain. Meanwhile, in January of 1776, Thomas Paine's pamphlet called Common Sense was published in Philadelphia and quickly sold over 100,000 copies. Paine's work sharply criticized the monarchy and aristocracy, and it offered a compelling argument for independence, appealing to a broad audience with its accessible language and clear arguments about the general geography of colonialism. At the time of Common Sense's publication, British actions continued to alienate the colonists, which exacerbated tensions. On May 15th of 1776, the Continental Congress voted to suppress all forms of authority under the British Crown. By July 2nd of 1776, the Congress took a decisive step, passing a resolution declaring that the colonies were free and independent states, effectively dissolving their ties with Great Britain. This was followed by the formal adoption of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, which enumerated 27 grievances against King George III, portraying him as a tyrant and solidifying the colony's decision to seek independence.